September 4th, 1944. The engines of the British 11th Armored Division roared through the cobblestone streets of Antwerp, the great Belgian port city. The tank crews, weary from weeks of relentless pursuit, braced themselves for the sight that inevitably greeted them in every captured harbor. Twisted steel, shattered concrete, and the skeletal remains of cranes collapsed into the harbor waters. It was standard German operating procedure. The scorched earth policy dictated that no asset be left useful to the enemy. Every major port the Germans had abandoned in this war, Cherbourg, Brest, Le Havre, had been systematically, ruthlessly demolished before retreat. The Allies expected nothing different here. They expected a graveyard of logistics, but Antwerp was different. As the British tanks rolled onto the waterfront, the commanders peered through their binoculars in disbelief. The port facilities were intact. The miles of docks were undamaged. The massive hydraulic cranes stood silent but functional against the gray sky. The warehouses, capable of holding mountains of cargo, stood ready. It was a miracle. Antwerp was Europe's second largest port, and following the destruction of Rotterdam in 1940, it stood as the single largest intact deep-water facility in Western Europe. It was a prize of incalculable strategic value. This complex was built to handle 40,000 tons of supplies per day, boasting direct heavy rail connections that ran straight into the heart of Germany. It had the capacity not just to assist, but to fully supply the entire Allied advance into the Third Reich. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces had achieved something remarkable, something that felt like divine intervention. They had captured the singular key that could solve the crippling Allied supply crisis. This was the facility that could keep 3 massive army groups moving east without a single pause. This was the asset that could, mathematically and strategically, end the war before Christmas of 1944. Montgomery immediately wired Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower with the electrifying news. Antwerp captured intact, port facilities undamaged, ready for immediate use. Eisenhower was stunned. For months, the specter of logistical failure had haunted Allied planners. The armies were advancing across France and Belgium faster than the supply lines could stretch. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system, was reaching its breaking point. Trucks were wearing out, tires were shredding, and drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. Fuel was running critically short. Tanks were being parked to siphon gas into other vehicles. Ammunition stocks were dwindling to dangerous levels. The further they moved from the Normandy beaches, the more fragile the lifeline became. Antwerp solved everything. It slashed the supply route distance by hundreds of miles. It replaced trucks with trains. It was the checkmate move, or it should have been. But for Antwerp to function, Montgomery had to do one more thing, a task that seemed minor compared to the liberation of a major city, but was in fact the linchpin of the entire operation. He had to clear the approaches to the port. Antwerp lay 60 miles inland from the North Sea. To reach the docks, ships had to navigate the Scheldt estuary, a treacherous, winding waterway that snaked through marshland, islands, and narrow channels. And currently, every single mile of that approach was controlled by the German 15th Army. On the southern bank, the Germans held fortified positions in the pockets of Breskens. On the northern approaches, German troops occupied Walcheren Island and the South Beveland Peninsula. They had established coastal artillery batteries that covered every inch of the shipping lanes. They had sown the dark, murky waters with thousands of magnetic and contact mines. They had clear fields of fire on any vessel foolish enough to attempt passage. No Allied ship could reach Antwerp's miracle docks until those German positions were cleared. Every gun had to be silenced. Every mine had to be swept. Every concrete fortification had to be stormed and captured. The captured port was a golden chalice, but the Scheldt estuary was the poisoned wine inside it. Until the river was secured, Antwerp was nothing more than a scenic tourist destination for British tankers. Montgomery's intelligence officers laid this reality out for him on September 5th, the very day after the city fell. They presented the maps. They pointed to the German batteries on Walcheren Island. The port cannot be used, they insisted. Not until the Scheldt approaches are cleared, not until the German artillery is eliminated, not until the waterway is open to the sea. The logic was irrefutable. The necessity was absolute. Montgomery understood the problem. He looked at the maps. He acknowledged the situation, and then he made a decision that would baffle historians and infuriate his peers for decades to come. He decided to ignore the Scheldt. he decided to do something else first. Why? To understand this catastrophic lapse in judgment, one must understand the intoxicating atmosphere of September 1944. Montgomery had spent the last month racing across Belgium and northern France in a blitzkrieg that rivaled the Germans' own success in 1940. His 21st Army Group had advanced 250 miles in 2 weeks. He had liberated Brussels on September 3rd to adoring crowds. He had captured Antwerp on September 4th. He was riding a wave of uninterrupted victory. In his mind, and in the minds of many commanders, the German army was not just retreating. It was finished, broken, disintegrating. Montgomery became convinced that the rules of logistics no longer applied because the enemy was on the verge of total collapse. He believed he could end the war with one singular, magnificent stroke. He didn't want to waste time bogged down in a dirty, wet clearing operation in the mud of the Scheldt. That was unglamorous work. That was mopping up. Montgomery wanted the kill shot. He envisioned one bold thrust into Holland, a narrow spearhead that would punch across the Rhine River, bypassing the formidable Siegfried Line defenses. It would be a combined airborne and armored assault to capture key bridges and open the backdoor route into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. He called it Operation Market Garden. His staff raised frantic questions. What about the Scheldt? What about securing Antwerp's approaches? What about ensuring we have the supplies to sustain this drive? If we extend our lines further without opening the port, are we not inviting disaster? Montgomery brushed aside their concerns, with the confidence of a man who believed he could do no wrong. The Germans are beaten, he told them. We must maintain momentum. If we stop to clear the river, the enemy will reorganize. We must strike now. Market Garden takes priority. He needed Eisenhower's approval for Market Garden, and he needed it fast. The operation would require massive, unprecedented resources. He demanded 3 entire Allied airborne divisions. He demanded priority for all fuel and ammunition deliveries, effectively starving the other Allied armies. He demanded control of the Allied air forces to support his advance. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. Eisenhower was skeptical. His broad front strategy called for advancing into Germany on multiple axes, keeping pressure on the enemy everywhere. Concentrating everything on Montgomery's single, narrow thrust meant halting General Patton in the south and General Hodges in the center. It meant accepting a massive strategic risk. It meant gambling the entire autumn campaign on Montgomery's assessment that the Germans were incapable of fighting back. But Montgomery made his case with absolute, mesmerizing confidence. Give me the resources, he argued, and I will be in Berlin by Christmas. I will end the war in 1944. The allure of ending the slaughter before winter was too strong to resist. Eisenhower approved Market Garden on September 10th. He gave Montgomery the priority he demanded. He assigned the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, and the British 1st Airborne to the operation. He committed the logistical reserves of the entire theater to this one roll of the dice. Neither man gave the order to clear the Scheldt estuary. They both assumed it could wait. They both assumed the war would be over before the port was needed. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of hubris and optimism, that would cost thousands of lives. By mid-September 1944, the reality of the supply crisis began to bite. The armies had advanced so far and so fast that the physics of logistics were rebelling. The main supply ports were still the Normandy beaches and Cherbourg, located over 400 miles behind the front lines. The math was unforgiving. Every gallon of gasoline used by a tank at the front had to be trucked 400 miles. The trucks themselves consumed fuel to make the round trip, burning a significant percentage of the payload they were carrying. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel. Vehicles were breaking down by the thousands. The Red Ball Express was a heroic effort, but it was a temporary patch on a gaping wound. The system was collapsing under its own weight. General George Patton's Third Army, the aggressive force that had torn through France, was running dry. His tanks were sitting idle east of Paris, engines cold. His advance toward the German border had stalled, not because of German resistance, there was barely any in his sector, but because the supply trucks simply couldn't reach him. The silence of those tanks was deafening. American crews who had spent August chasing the Wehrmacht at breakneck speed were now sitting on their hulls, watching the autumn rain turn the roads to sludge. They knew the Germans were reeling. They knew the road to the Rhine was open. But without fuel, A Sherman tank is just a 30-ton steel bunker. The momentum that had carried them from Normandy was evaporating, replaced by a creeping dread. General Courtney Hodges's First Army was in a similar bind. They were rationing ammunition. Units were being told to limit artillery fire to emergency missions only. Machine gunners were told to conserve rounds. Commanders had to make every shot count because replacements weren't arriving. The greatest industrial power on Earth, the United States, had an army that was running out of bullets, not because they didn't have them, but because they couldn't move them. The solution sat in Antwerp, a port capable of delivering 40,000 tons daily, located just miles from the front, with rail connections that could move supplies directly to the armies without burning gasoline. But Antwerp's docks were empty. No ships could reach them. The Scheldt estuary remained firmly in German hands, the 15th Army digging in deeper every day. Montgomery's 21st Army Group received the priority allocation of all available supplies. Everything fuel, ammo, food was being diverted north to support Market Garden. American armies were told to consolidate positions, to defend rather than attack, to wait while Montgomery attempted his decisive thrust. Patton protested furiously to Eisenhower. "We're being starved," he argued. "We could be advancing into Germany right now. Instead, we're sitting still while Montgomery gets everything for an operation that isn't even addressing our supply problem." But Eisenhower held firm. Market Garden launches September 17th. When it succeeds, the supply situation will improve. When we control Holland and cross the Rhine, the strategic picture changes. September 17th, 1944. The sky over Holland turned dark with aircraft. 3 Allied airborne divisions dropped from the clouds. The U.S. 101st Airborne at Eindhoven, the U.S. 22nd Airborne at Nijmegen, the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem. It was the largest airborne operation in military history, a spectacle of power and ambition. The plan was to capture a series of bridges across rivers and canals, creating a carpet for British ground forces to race across Holland and into Germany. If it worked, Montgomery promised, the war would end in weeks. It didn't work. The intelligence had been wrong. The German army was not broken. The resistance was stronger, faster, and more vicious than predicted. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, right on top of the British drop zones. The single highway the British tanks had to travel became a killing ground, easily blocked by burning vehicles. The timeline slipped. The bridges were blown or fiercely defended. British paratroopers at Arnhem were surrounded, cut off, and overwhelmed. The operation collapsed. In 9 days of bitter, tragic fighting. The casualties were devastating. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, more casualties than the D-Day landings. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. German forces retained control of the Rhine River crossings. The corridor into Germany remained closed. The bold gamble had failed. Montgomery declared the operation 90% successful. He claimed valuable ground had been gained. He argued that lessons had been learned. He showed no inclination to accept responsibility for the disaster. But the strategic reality was grim. The war would not end in 1944. The quick win was a mirage. And now, the Allies faced a terrifying truth. Winter was approaching. Their armies were stalled. Their supplies were exhausted. And they still didn't have a port. By early October 1944, the Allied High Command was confronting the consequences of their choices. The German army had not collapsed. In fact, the victory at Arnhem had revitalized their morale. Eisenhower called a conference of his senior commanders. The topic was logistics. How to sustain operations through the winter. How to prepare for spring offensives. How to solve the supply problem that was crippling the entire theater. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. It had been obvious since September 4th. Antwerp. Open the port, clear the Scheldt. Get ships bringing supplies directly to Belgium instead of trucking everything from Normandy. Montgomery was asked why the Scheldt hadn't been cleared yet. He explained that his forces had been committed to Market Garden, that clearing the estuary would require significant resources, that German positions were strongly fortified, that the operation would take time. Eisenhower's patience, legendary for its durability, finally snapped. "I gave you priority for Market Garden," he told Montgomery. "It failed. Now open Antwerp. Make it your top priority. Get the port operational before winter." Montgomery agreed. He would assign the Canadian First Army to clear the Scheldt. The operation would begin immediately. But October was already half over. Antwerp had been captured on September 4th. 6 weeks had passed with the port sitting useless. 6 weeks when Allied armies could have been receiving 40,000 tons of supplies daily. 6 weeks that would have consequences nobody in that conference room fully understood yet. The task fell to the Canadians. The Battle of the Scheldt would prove to be one of the most miserable, grueling, and overlooked campaigns of the entire war. The Canadian First Army received orders to clear the estuary in mid-October. Their mission was to eliminate German forces on both banks of the waterway, capture the fortress of Walcheren Island, and secure the approaches to Antwerp. The terrain was a nightmare. The Scheldt area was composed of low-lying polders, land reclaimed from the sea, surrounded by high dikes. The Germans, knowing an attack was inevitable, had destroyed the dikes, flooding vast areas with freezing seawater. The Canadian troops weren't just attacking a fortified enemy. They were attacking through an environmental catastrophe. Infantry had to wade through flooded fields, the water waist-deep and freezing. Tanks couldn't maneuver off the narrow tops of the dikes, where they were silhouetted against the sky, serving as perfect targets for German anti-tank guns. The German 15th Army didn't just have concrete bunkers, they had weaponized the landscape itself. When they blew the dikes, they turned the battlefield into a freezing, briny soup of mud and mines. For the Canadian soldiers, this wasn't just a battle, it was a descent into hell. There were no foxholes to dig. If you put a shovel in the ground, you hit water in 6 inches. There was no cover. The land was as flat as a table. Men wounded in the assault didn't just fall. They slipped into the freezing mud and often drowned before medics could reach them under the heavy fire. It was a miserable, wet, rat-infested slog where the enemy was often invisible until the water around you started boiling with machine gun fire. The fighting was savage and close quarters. Canadian infantry assaulted concrete bunkers while wading in freezing water. Engineers cleared minefields under direct artillery fire. Artillery pounded German positions that had to be taken one at a time, yard by bloody yard. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day. The operation that Montgomery had dismissed as a simple mopping-up exercise stretched into November. The casualties mounted at a horrific rate. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division lost 2,000 men just taking the South Bevelin Peninsula. British forces assaulting Walcheren Island suffered another 8,000 casualties. The German defenders fought with desperate tenacity because they understood the strategic stakes. They knew exactly what they were preventing. As long as they held the Scheldt, Antwerp's port remained useless. As long as the port was useless, Allied supply lines stayed stretched to the breaking point. As long as supply lines stayed stretched, Allied offensives remained limited. They fought for every fortification, every village, every mile of waterway. They made the Canadians pay in blood for every advance. They were buying time for the Third Reich to prepare its winter defenses. Finally, on November 8, 1944, after weeks of relentless horror, Canadian forces secured Walcheren Island. The last German positions controlling the Scheldt were captured. The estuary was in Allied hands, but the victory was not yet complete. The waterway was choked with mines. Every channel had to be swept. Every approach verified safe. Navy minesweepers began the tedious, dangerous work of making the Scheldt passable. On November 28, 1944, the Liberty ship SS Times Fort Cataraqui Times slowly entered Antwerp harbor. It was the first Allied vessel to reach the port since its capture 85 days earlier. The docks that had sat empty for nearly 3 months finally began receiving cargo. 85 days. The number hung in the air like an accusation. From September 4th, when British forces captured the intact port, to November 28th, when the first supply ship arrived. 85 days when those port facilities could have been delivering 40,000 tons daily to Allied armies. The arithmetic of the delay was staggering. 85 days at 40,000 tons per day equals 3.4 million tons of supplies. That is a mountain of material. It represents enough fuel to keep every Allied army advancing continuously into Germany. It represents enough ammunition to sustain major offensives across the entire front. It represents enough winter clothing, food, and medical supplies to maintain the health and morale of millions of men. Instead, that 3.4 million tons never arrived. Allied armies had spent September, October, and most of November struggling with supply shortages that paralyzed their operations. all while Antwerp's miracle port sat empty, a monument to misplaced priorities. Montgomery never acknowledged that prioritizing Market Garden over the Scheldt had been a mistake. He never admitted that 6 weeks had been wasted chasing a fantasy of a quick victory. He never accepted responsibility for the delay that crippled Allied operations through the fall. But the enemy had noticed. By late November, when Antwerp finally opened, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The easy advances of late summer were a distant memory. German defenses had solidified along the Siegfried Line. The weather had turned miserable, with heavy snows and freezing fog. Winter warfare was beginning. And in the dense, snow-covered Ardennes forest, German forces were quietly, secretly assembling for a massive counteroffensive. Adolf Hitler had decided to exploit the Allied supply problems and their overstretched front lines. He had been watching the reports. He saw the Allied advance stall in September. He saw the logistical struggles. He knew the Allies were weak. He was concentrating his last reserves, his best panzer divisions, for one desperate gamble. The delay in opening Antwerp had given Germany exactly what it needed: time. Time to prepare, time to reorganize, time to launch the attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944. The silence of the Ardennes was shattered by the roar of artillery. German forces launched their offensive through thinly defended American positions in Belgium. Over 200,000 German troops attacked along a 75-mile front. The assault achieved complete surprise. American casualties in the first 48 hours were catastrophic. Entire battalions were overrun. Communication networks collapsed. Supply dumps were captured. The German advance created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. The timing was not coincidental. Hitler had chosen to attack in December for specific reasons. He knew Allied supply lines were still strained. The port of Antwerp had only been open for 3 weeks and was still building up to full capacity. The supplies had not yet fully trickled down to the frontline units. Allied armies were spread thin. German intelligence had monitored Allied supply traffic throughout the fall. They knew about the fuel shortages. They knew about ammunition rationing. They knew that Allied armies had been unable to maintain sustained pressure during September, October, and November because they lacked the logistical tail to do so. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's attempt to split the Allied armies, drive all the way to the coast, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. The plan was fantastically optimistic and ultimately doomed to fail, but it succeeded in inflicting enormous casualties and extending the war by months. Over 80,000 Americans became casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 were killed in action. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men in the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. Fighting lasted 6 weeks in brutal, sub-zero conditions. The German offensive was eventually defeated. Allied forces eliminated the Bulge and resumed their advance into Germany. But precious time had been lost. Lives had been spent. Winter warfare had taken a terrible toll on soldiers who might have been better supplied, better positioned, and perhaps even already in Germany if Antwerp had opened in September instead of late November. This was the ultimate cost of the empty port. It wasn't paid in ledgers or logistical reports. It wasn't paid by the generals in their warm headquarters. It was paid here, in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, by teenage American riflemen shivering in summer uniforms that should have been replaced months ago. They were fighting for their lives with rationed ammunition and dwindling medical supplies, holding the line against a German army that, by all rights, should have been crushed back in September. They paid the price for the gamble that failed. After Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers interrogated the captured German generals about the Ardennes offensive. They wanted to understand how Germany, seemingly beaten in the summer of 1944, had assembled such a powerful attack force in late 1944. They wanted to know when the decision was made. They wanted to know if earlier Allied action could have prevented it. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, was asked when serious planning for the Ardennes offensive began. His answer was revealing. Hitler announced the plan in mid-September 1944. Jodl submitted formal operational plans by early October. Why then? Because that was when it became clear that Allied advances had stalled. That was when they realized the Allies were constrained by logistics. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the west, testified that the delay in opening Antwerp was noticed immediately by German intelligence. They monitored the lack of shipping. They observed that major offensives weren't being launched. They concluded that logistics were constraining Allied operations. The German generals made clear that September and early October 1944 had been the critical months. That was when Germany's western defenses were most vulnerable. That was when sustained Allied pressure could have prevented Germany from reorganizing. That was when opening Antwerp could have maintained the momentum from the summer breakout. Instead, Allied armies had paused. Market Garden had consumed resources for an operation that failed. The Scheldt remained in German hands, while Canadian forces were committed elsewhere. And Germany used the time, that precious, irreplaceable gift of time, to prepare its last desperate counterattack. War is won by logistics as much as by battles. The most brilliant tactics fail if supplies don't reach the front. Montgomery's choice to prioritize Market Garden over clearing the Scheldt estuary revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what mattered most in September 1944. He believed one more spectacular operation could end the war. He was seduced by the glory of the lightning strike. He was wrong. The unglamorous work of clearing mines, capturing fortifications, and opening supply lines didn't appeal to him. It wasn't the kind of operation that would make him the man who won the war, so he pursued glory instead. And because of that choice, the war continued, the winter came, and thousands of men died in the snow, waiting for supplies that arrived 3 months too late.